how you see the evolution of Romania, of Romanian society since the 1980s, given the fact that you were here, you worked at the embassy in Bucharest before 1989, and you said that young people in Romania will see the evolution if they knew how things were in the 80s.
Yeah.
My question to you is, how did you see the Romania of the 80s, and if you were ever afraid being in the Romania of the 80s as part of the embassy personnel, and given the fact that you were here during the Cold War?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, of course, we were treated very differently, mainly because we were foreigners, and therefore the Romanian state at that time made sure that we had no contact with Romanians, and that Romanians were not allowed to speak to us, which I think some younger Romanians find very difficult. Well, A, they didn't know that that was the case, and B, they found it very strange, but it was true. I don't think I had a proper in-depth conversation with a Romanian until 2018, when I was preparing to come back here. There was certainly fear. We knew that the Securitate would try to blackmail foreign diplomats if they could. There was one such successful attempt at a cultivation during my time here, when one of my colleagues had to leave the country very early because of what Securitate were trying to do to him. So we had reason to be very cautious indeed, and we knew, we assessed that everywhere we had anything to say that we would be listened to, and we sometimes found the evidence of that. So it was definitely a Cold War posting. I was a representative of a NATO state. I was in a Warsaw Pact state, albeit one that was uncomfortable for the Soviet Union. But it was certainly a very difficult time to be a diplomat here. I think the point about people understanding where Romania was at that time is really fundamental. And it's not so much about where we knew Romania to be then as what we can now understand better about the situation. But in 1989, Romania was the last of the countries to revolt against communism. It was the only country in which the state authorities used weapons and killed its own nationals in an attempt to hang on to power. But what we now know is that Romania was the least plural country of any in Central and Eastern Europe. There was no alternative thought being given to any aspect of modern life. Whereas in Hungary, for example, economic reform had been engaged in the 1950s. In Poland, there had always been pluralism because of the role of the Catholic Church, and books were freely available. In East Germany, most people had some sort of access to West German media, but in Romania, this was the deep freeze of the Cold War. So when the time came to change, nobody had been planning here. Nobody had ready-made thoughts about what we would do. And I think that's really, really important. And we know that reform did not start until about 1996, after the election of President Constantinescu. So you have the country in the worst socio-economic position that can't reform and doesn't for the first 7 years. And then you see that country has now overtaken Greece and Croatia in GDP per head terms. It's got, year after year, a higher growth rate than all of its neighbours. And that's how you appreciate that something rather special is happening in Romania. But that, of course, is not the majority perspective in Romania about Romania.
It's a common question among Romanians of a certain age as well. Where were you when the revolution in 1989 happened? How did you hear about the revolution, and did you expect it? Because you were talking about the fact that nobody was expecting it.
Well, not only did I not expect it, I was at work in the Foreign Office, where my job was to be the policy desk officer for the then European Community's relationship with Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So from the 1st of November 1989, I was helping roll out, from a British perspective, the EU, as it now is, response to the revolutions and the FAR programme and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and all those sorts of things. And in December, I was, because it was, you know, a very long time ago, technologically speaking, I was being rung on my landline by the wife of a colleague from here who was keeping me up to date with what radio reports out of Romania were saying. And I was actually denying that this could be a revolution that would topple the system. I did not believe it.
So you just told them, no, no, you're wrong.
It'll not happen, I said. Now, I don't particularly want to say that I was right, but of course, I think what we now know that we had was a popular revolution taking place all over the country, but we got a proto-communist government immediately afterwards, led by somebody who had been within nomenclatura circles for all of his adult life. So I think I must leave it to Romanians to decide about their own experiences in late 1989. But it's clear that this was a government that didn't give up. You know, it killed hundreds and thousands of its own citizens in clinging on to power, to say no more than that.
Were you ever curious to find if you ever had a file at GNSS, you know, the archives of the old Securitate?
Yeah.
Were you ever curious to know? Do
Yeah,
you have
I've seen my papers. Yeah.
And
It's intensely boring.
Oh, really?
Intensely boring.
Okay.
And frankly, if I'd been marking the homework, I think there's some really obvious mistakes being made, and they didn't spot my vulnerabilities or what would have looked like vulnerabilities from anybody trying to do the work. I think there were a lot of people who were going through the motions, doing very extensive manuscript reports, and I almost couldn't get to the end of the reading.
Did the people who do this disappoint you, or were you expecting them to do this?
They didn't disappoint me, because I think if you're living in a regime as repressive as Ceausescu's was, and you know, if I share my own belief that revolution wasn't going to happen, you know, if you as a Romanian living in Romania think the revolution's never going to happen, how do you guarantee a living for your family? So I've never ever blamed anybody for working with what was a dominating repressive regime. I don't know how I would have reacted under similar circumstances. Of course, I would like to think that I would have led the dissidents and, you know, all of that. But I think the reality is that human nature, when faced with that level of repression, and as we later saw, violence, that you actually have to do the best for your family under those circumstances. So I've never ever blamed any of the people who informed or worked for Securitate, unless of course they did acts that were illegal by any normal standard of legality. I think people have to take responsibility for their actions. It's never a question I've needed to address, but simply conforming with the law and writing up, you know, I bumped into a foreigner and this is what he said, I would certainly have been doing that myself.
Did you ever talk to those people who wrote things about you that you found in the files, or?
I've not spoken, I've not met any of the people who were real informers as I saw in my file, no. I just haven't seen them.
This year you held a reception for, it was before the Pride, the Bucharest Pride,
Yeah.
and you said something along the lines of, it's not freedom if somebody else defines it for you. Do you think the Romanian society is ready to understand that? That nobody defines anybody else's freedom? even if we talk about LGBTQ plus rights, even other rights?
I think the question needs to be put in the right way, and I absolutely think that Romanians are capable of understanding that. You know, they know how much they had to sacrifice and when they didn't have human rights. And I don't think I would meet anybody in Romania who thought that anybody should not have their human rights. Have you ever met anybody in Romania who didn't think that human rights should be for everybody? I think the LGBTQI plus question gets manipulated. I think there is I recognise an awful lot of silly stories about the LGBT community in Romania that I remember from the UK when we were at a similar stage of our development. But I firmly believe that the majority doesn't have to agree with the form of human rights. Everybody has a right to their human rights. You know, I was here for the referendum in October 2018, and to its credit, the Romanian constitution doesn't define marriage as the union of a man and a woman. So, in a way, the constitution's much further ahead than some of the politicians who would like to be very reactionary in the way that that is rolled out. But I look forward to same-sex marriage becoming as big a non-issue in Romania as it is in the UK, because as soon as the legislation was passed in the UK, everybody went back to their ordinary lives, and it was not a difficult issue, and it isn't a difficult issue today.
You were here in 2018 on August 10th,
Yeah.
and you said it was kind of a lesson about Romanian politics. How come? Could
Well,
you elaborate on that?
I think Romanians care passionately about the way that they're governed, and I'm glad I was here for the 10th of August, because I missed all of Resist. When I had ambassadors who'd been here in early 2017, they told all the stories about Resist rallies and all of that, and I missed that entirely. But I did see the last big demonstration of people's power, and I saw how it was responded to. And the message I took from that is that Romania is still a country that is actually very active in pursuing its democratic rights. Again, I don't think that's what Romanians say to each other across the dinner table. I think there's a risk of Romanians always thinking that all the problems here are made in Romania, only suffered by Romania, and everybody else has got it far better. The truth is, I think Romania has normalised. Not in every, it has national characteristics. It has particular versions of problems, but I think it's got the same problems that we all have, our own version of. A belief or not in whether Romanians care about democracy is one of those. Nobody in the UK thinks anybody cares about politics. It's a truism across the world. But I have seen the evidence of it with my own eyes in Bucharest.
That Romanian cares about politics?
Yeah.
Is there something you learned as a diplomat when it comes to talking or negotiating with politicians?
I hope so, because I've spent the last 5 years doing it. Well, I think they have an incredibly difficult job. So one of the things I've learnt is respect. And respect at the same time as being able to privately disagree with what they say. I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've witnessed at very close hand, because of course I know Romanian politicians much better than I know British politicians. But again, I think they're suffering the same sorts of challenges in a modern communications world. I think it's an immensely difficult job to legislate for all human activity in a country, and in that respect I think it's probably more difficult to be a Romanian legislator because of your legal system and your requirement to have laws for everything, we don't have, we don't have laws for everything, because essentially, this is a gross oversimplification, but we have laws to prevent bad things happen. You need a law to allow a good thing to happen. So our politicians are not passing the amount of legislation or required to be as expert in as many different fields as Romanian politicians. And so actually seeing the huge range of what they're expected to know, I think I find very humbling.
You were an ambassador here during Brexit, and everybody was fearful of what was going to happen with all the Romanians in the UK. And you explained that very well, that no bad things will happen to the Romanians in the UK. How do you see the Romanian community in the United Kingdom now? Because they almost all of them have settled status.
Yeah.
It's almost 1 million Romanians.
Well, almost 1 million or up to 1.4. I mean, there are different statistics, and I think 1.2 million are registered under the settled status scheme. And I'm delighted to see that it's a population which is stable and committed to life in the UK and is working extremely hard for their own benefit and for the incidental benefit of my country and all of the communities of the UK. But the UK is a real kaleidoscope country nowadays. We have changed so much in 40 years by being open to the world. And so it's a community, a country in which Romanians don't particularly stand out. I don't think they want to on the whole, but they are immensely hard-working in all sectors. So it's a very, very happy set of circumstances that this island in the cold part of Europe has been adopted as home by so many Romanians who are used to a much nicer climate. I think that says some good things about my country. I hope so. I look forward to sort of meeting more and more of them when I go back to live in the UK.
Will you buy sarmale from the Romanians in the UK? Because you have a video that you made when you were in Romania, and it's pretty famous with you making. Will you buy them or will you make them in London?
Well, first of all, I need to get used to living in the UK again, because we haven't lived there properly since 2009. So, and of course in 2009 there were virtually no Romanians living in the UK at all. So I don't know how big the Romanian population is in the part of outer London that I live in. I do know some bits of the country where I'd be absolutely guaranteed to find a close by Romanian store where I could buy the sarmale. But sarmale I can make. The thing that I'm more worried about is smântână. And
it's not the clotted cream.
It's definitely not clotted cream. I mean, we've got lots and lots of different versions of cream. I mean, more versions of cream on sale in the UK than any country I know. And I think it's probably closest to crème fraîche. It's definitely not sour cream, which used to be how you translated smântână. But my word, the different varieties of smântână, I'm going to have to find a Romanian shop to buy that from.
And when it comes to British nationals coming to Romania, what do they find here? Because they're all enchanted of Romania.
Yeah.
And I'm also talking about the people who started NGOs in the beginning of the 90s.
Yeah.
And you supported those NGOs. Where I'm talking about Casa Ioana, I'm talking about hospice. What did they find here? What did they tell you that they found here in Romania and it made them stay in the end?
Well, even though it's fantastic, the answer is not the wine. I think there are two overwhelming factors, either of which would be very, very persuasive. The first is the people. And you are all very welcoming. You make us feel at home. You make it feel as if we should stay. And that warmth and that openness isn't what you find everywhere. The other thing is quite simply the innate quality of life that you have in Romania. I was at a dinner last night where I produced, I almost had 10 Romanian citizens in tears at the thought that we take our visitors to Piața Obor. Because Piața Obor, you know, we don't have anywhere like that. You know, I mean, we have a Harrods food stall, but nobody shops there apart from a very small number of people living in central London. We have our markets, but we don't have the produce, but we don't have the climate that produces the quality of produce. You know, go and eat grapes in the UK and you will be disappointed, I promise you. Go and eat tomatoes in the middle of summer in the UK, and unless you've grown them yourself, you will be disappointed. And you know, you go to a Romanian market, and it's a bit like a Garden of Eden in an urban environment. And that's just one small example. But you know, the climate is fabulous. The space that you have, admittedly not everywhere in the city, but where the foreigners tend to live, and we can afford a bit of space, it's more than we can afford in lives in the UK. So I think we come here and are able to lead wonderful lives alongside really very, very good friends. And the wine does help.
And because we talked about British nationals who fell in love with Romania, I have to ask you about King Charles III. You don't have to speak in his name, but what did you hear that made him stay here and come here over and over again, even now when he's king?
Well, I think his speech in Cotroceni Palace is the definitive description, and it is in his own words. You know, officials may have been involved in the drafting of a speech, but that is His Majesty speaking directly to the Romanian people. And I think it's worth emphasising that his relationship with Romania started many years before he came here, and the pain that he recognised Romanian people were suffering in the 1980s is the starting point of his fascination, which became a love story. And he used the word, you know, I love this country and its people. So it's in a way a version of what everybody has found. The particular elements that the king prioritises, and he said it, is the way in which Romania has managed to hold on to so much of the wonders of the natural world that most countries in Europe have lost. We in the UK probably, we've lost more than any. You know, I think, did our last bear die in the 15th century? You know, we don't have wolves, we don't have the forests that are big enough to support bears or wolves. We don't have, in Sibiu last year, he quoted Romania with 200 butterflies and the UK with 40. And we're countries of similar size. We have huge diversity of landscape, so theoretically we could be very well off, but Romania has kept it. And it's something that he absolutely prizes, wants Romanians to be more aware of so that they protect it better. And that's in an era when you are getting the ability to travel around the country much more easily. You know, it's really, really important that there are protective strategies that have got real teeth so that you preserve the wildflowers and the butterflies and the birds and the large mammals, even when Maramureș is only a 4-hour drive by motorway. You know, and that is going to happen pretty soon. So, you know, he is being a militant in terms of protecting the natural environment, because you've got something so very, very important here to protect. And the other thing, of course, is his passion for architecture, which he thinks produces a real harmony with the people who live in good architecture. And that's a philosophy that he has proposed for a very long time. His model village of Panbury in Dorset provides exactly that sort of environment. And what he sees across the whole country, not just in Transylvania, though his house is in Transylvania, so that's where he spends time. He sees architecture which is sympathetic to the people who live in it, and beautiful. And again, we've lost that.
And this brings me back to the fact that British nationals actually got involved, including King Charles III, into topics that were foreign to Romanians, that were too hard to do for Romanians. I'm talking about people sick of cancer, I'm talking about hospice, I'm talking about homeless people, like Casa Ioana. How did they get to do this in Romania, in a foreign country, where they didn't know anybody? And do you have any insight on this?
I think Alistair Campbell once said, we don't do God in British politics. So I'm now, for the first time ever, probably going to talk in Christian terms, because the great majority of the humanitarian wave that came from the UK in 1990 was from churches up and down the country. And the Christian requirement to provide charity is something that you will find very pronounced indeed in British churches. And the actual humanitarian actions that started then, they're still continuing. You know, there are still hundreds and hundreds of schools up and down the UK collecting shoeboxes of toys and books and clothes for children at Christmas, and they're still being delivered here. But it was, you know, some of the most doughty people who came with that humanitarian mission, who once they were here recognised other needs, and because of the attraction of the people and of the quality of life and other factors, they settled, and they've developed these other charities because they found other Romanians who wanted to work with them. And most of them I now need to describe as British origin, because most of them are now perfectly Romanian operations, one of which was voted best hospital in the country last year. So it's the naturalness of a humanitarian reaction, fueled by Christian faith and a belief in charity. You know, the parable of the Good Samaritan is probably the parable best known in the UK, despite us being a country with a very high quotient of atheists. But that idea of doing something for your fellow man and a volunteer culture is right at the centre of British society, and I'm happy to see that developing in Romania, particularly amongst Romania's young people, who are an example to hold up for anybody for examination.
Here at the embassy you have the British flag and you have the Ukrainian flag. And I remember you were one of the first diplomats, if not the first diplomat, who talked about the war. I think it was the second day or the third day of the war. What made Britain stay near Ukraine and support Ukraine for so much time? Because neighboring countries now we see are a little bit hesitant, are a little bit tired of supporting Ukraine, but the United Kingdom seems to be a strong supporter of Ukraine still, 1 year and a half, more than a year and a half after the war started.
I think it is tough a year and a half on to maintain the extremely high level of support that all neighbouring countries provided to Ukraine after the 24th of February last year. I think countries that are in election campaigns we should give a little bit of freedom of manoeuvre to, in the expectation that they will revert to non-politicised expressions later on. But for the UK, you know, I think I can speak for the UK in the same way that I can speak for Romania. I mean, that's not my job, but what I hear everywhere is British perspectives reflected by Romanians, not because they're telling me what I already know, but it's their perception as well, which is that the citizens of Ukraine are fighting for our freedom and for our democracy. And that if they were to fail, we would all sleep less soundly in our beds. We would have much greater fears. We would have anxiety about what the future course of action might indicate. And of course, in the case of the United Kingdom, one might think that by being at the cold end of Europe, that we don't suffer in the same way that somebody with who's very, very close to Russia suffers. And I think of the distance from the Danube Delta to Crimea under Russian occupation. But of course, we've actually had British citizens killed in the UK by agents of the Russian state. You know, we're not in any doubt at all about the difficulty of persuading the regime in Moscow that an international legal system, which is what we used to have until partly created by the Soviet Union, that those checks and balances and that guarantee that we all had, that we were not going to aggress our neighbours, that's a far better way of living together and all prospering than this terrible 18th century approach to grabbing somebody else's territory is concerned. But I think it's, you know, the UK and Romania, we have an identical analysis of the Ukraine situation, of the need to help the Ukrainians in every department to win this fight. And I pray that Russia will take the decision that they have to go back to Russia. It's the only place for them, and I'm certain that Russian people want that as well. I mean, we remember the effect of the body bags coming back from Afghanistan, which is what ultimately persuaded the powers that be in Moscow to call off the occupation of Afghanistan. Don't you feel that it's inevitable that the same phenomenon happens? Especially with what we're told is an even higher death rate in a much smaller time frame than the Afghan conflict.
Britain is a multicultural land. Romania is starting to become a multicultural land because there are a lot of immigrants coming to Romania. Everybody sees them. Is there a lesson that Britain could give to Romania in terms of embracing the people who come here, who are different than us culturally, nationally?
Well, it's a difficult question because, of course, looking after newly arrived communities is something that we all know is difficult, and therefore we all have to put special effort into. And I don't want to say we've got it right. But I think we are a tolerant country. You know, the first thing that we did after Brexit was put in arrangements so that all of the EU citizens in the UK could stay there very, very easily. We've got 200 languages being spoken in London. You know, I, as a British ambassador, I am, you know, an old-fashioned Brit with my white skin, but I've got colleagues in the embassy here who represent the full rainbow of the United Kingdom, and there isn't really, I mean, again, I mustn't get complacent because, you know, we are always finding areas that we need to be more tolerant and where we need to promote multiculturalism much more effectively than we already do. But I think we've made a good start, and it wasn't always like that in the UK. It's an actual political development that politicians decided that we had to provide a good home for these people who were, after all, fundamental to our economy and to the richness of our society. And it takes a political act. It doesn't just happen. And it didn't just happen because we had the Commonwealth and the Empire. You know, if you go back into the 1940s, 50s, 60s, it was not a very, very tolerant country. But it's something that we decided we needed to do. And I hope that that decision will also be taken for Romania, because, you know, when you're in Schengen, as you will be at some stage, UK never wanted Schengen. You want it, so we hope you get it. But Romania will be on the migration trail for the first time. And although you have a much higher number of foreign workers now in Romania, which is a big and very recent change, that will only grow. Also liberating your economy from the shortage of labour that you suffer from at the moment. But it's very easy for that kind of development to be instrumentalised by extremists of whatever kind, and it requires real political leadership from those hard-working politicians who've already got a lot on their plate to actually show the majority population why this is an element of strength for the future of Romania.
And the last question, you said in a previous interview that you are going to follow the model of your king and come back to Romania. Will you come back to Romania to a music festival, because you are already at music festivals in Romania? When will you come back to Romania for the first time after you leave your posting?
Well, I haven't got any tickets booked yet, but I am looking at 2 dates that I'll come back, and they're both in the month after I leave. So I hope to be back here for specific purposes in November. It's not a guaranteed promise just yet, but I'm hoping that I will retain a real connection with this country that, you know, I too have come to love. I've lived in București city twice as much as I've ever lived in the city of London, and I started my career here. I will finish it here. I've got lots of good friends. The list of places that I still haven't visited is longer than the list I arrived in the country with, even though I've been travelling a lot. But you know, Romania is something that my whole family feel very blessed that they have come to know, and I'm sure it's going to be a feature of our lives.
What's the one place you really want to visit in Romania and you didn't get to?
Oh, that's going to create all sorts of problems, though, isn't it?
So no.
Well, a place that I know I've visited very inadequately is the Delta. I've been in one season. We had a fabulous tour there with a very dear geologist friend, and you know, and he said, you must come back in September. It's different in September, and I was going to, and then it didn't happen. So that's right on the top of the to-do list. But it's a very long to-do list, because, you know, we spent summer in Maramureș, but not remotely long enough, and we saw only half of the things. But part of what we want to do is just live, to have that tranquility, that quality of life, to sit in beautiful villages and beautiful cities with fabulous restaurants, with good Romanian friends.